Hello and welcome everyone. We are excited to kick off our second webinar of the year with Object Edge. Why business should not own data, who should own data and not IT. My name is Abby Nesbitt. I'm the digital specialist here at Syndigo's marketing team, MC of all things webinar. And I want to thank you so much for joining today. Let's start off with a few introductions of who will be on the call with us. Today, we're joined by Vinny Marici, Senior Vice President of Data Engineering at Object Edge, Adam Arbor, Principal Consultant of Data at Object Edge, and Rob Stowell, Digital Transformation Leader here at Syndigo. Today, these folks are going to discuss why IT shouldn't be the default project owner of the data projects. They'll share real-world examples where data projects have succeeded and failed, and at the hands of wrong business owners, and how to leverage the strengths of the organization to drive more successful outcomes. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We will be recording this presentation and we'll be sharing it within a follow-up email that you're going to receive within 24 hours after the webinar today. And your line is going to remain muted. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. And we will bring them up at the end of the presentation today. If we don't have time, please leave your name. There's the option to leave questions anonymously, but leave your name. If we run out of time, we'll get back to you via email. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Vinny. Take it away for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. I do think that today's topic is one that, at least from the three of the panelists here, from our perspective, is a question we hear a lot, because I think at this point there's no true right answer in terms of the maturity of a lot of these data initiatives that are ongoing. And part of what we wanted to do is not just explain why it's so hard to identify which part of the organization should own data initiatives, but to also give you our purview, our perspective, our opinion on it. You'll see that, there's going to be maybe some, I don't want to say controversial opinions, but opinions that we feel like will drive the most success within an organization. One thing that I do want to echo from Abby in this housekeeping slide is please, 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 if you hear something and you want to ask a question, please submit that question. We're more than happy to answer them. And we want to make sure that we create as much clarity around a topic that I believe doesn't have very much clarity right now. And so with that, let's get into some of the first topics that we're going to be discussing. As a quick intro again, my name is Vinny Marici. I head the data business unit at Object Edge. So everything from master data management to merchandising and syndication to business intelligence and analytics. And I know myself, and same with Adam and Rob, we've got a lot of experience both at the mid-market level all the way up to Fortune 100 organizations, and how we help and consult some of the organizations into their best practices of these data initiatives. So as an icebreaker question for us to get this discussion going, Rob, I'm going to start with you. Really broad level question, and you can also add to maybe an extended introduction of yourself if you'd like. But what is the biggest data related challenge that you faced in your role and years as a consultant?
Sure, I will elaborate a bit, right? Because, my name's Rob Stoll. I've been a master data management specialist since well before it was an acronym. I always like to joke and tell my origin story. I was in steering committees where we were discussing whether or not the internet was a fad, right? So that's kind of how long data has been critically important to organizations, and the real awareness between organizational data practices kind of grew up with the internet as we started to see all of our mistakes in data show up in the internet as well. In terms of complexity of projects, I've done 500 million SKU projects. I've done, global projects that, have multiple different languages and multiple different countries associated to it. But really, the biggest, most challenging projects we've ever had are around the idea of data ownership. When you go forward with a master data management implementation plan and you don't really have a great plan to solicit the rest of the organization's involvement, sometimes it's fine, right? Sometimes you kind of get through that, but often, we see a lot of master data management projects stall because there is no real ownership of data within an organization. So I think this is very topical, as I see it's one of the biggest challenges during an implementation.
Great, thank you, Rob. Adam, what about you? What have you seen as some of the biggest data-related challenges since you've been a consultant?
Yeah, having been a consultant, worked in master data management for like 12 years across various projects. I won't name names, but I think every consultant has had that moment where they're a couple months into a large scale data project or a master data project or something along those lines. It could even be governance. And typically when they're these large enterprise projects, they're owned by IT, they're driven by IT CapEx dollars, and they're introducing this solution for the first time to the business. And someone comes off mute and goes, "This is the first I'm hearing of this," or, "That's not how we do things." And your heart just sinks. That was actually one of my first master data projects way back in the day. I worked with a global engagement where it was a company that had like acquired a dozen different companies. So it was more of an M&A acquisition style. And they had set out to like consolidate like a myriad of the ERPs and planning systems that they had inherited. And it was just a painful rollout, of this new operating model and realistically to different geographic regions and sub-brands and all these other things that either had no buy-in and more than likely had no input to the requirements before they had even purchased the software. So yeah, that was probably my biggest challenge. One of my early projects, I learned a lot of lessons around that in stakeholder engagement, data ownership, stewardship. So this is a great topic to start with.
Yeah, and I think part of this, and by the way, what you guys will see as we go through this webinar, we're going to pop up some polls for you guys. I'm not going to wait between each poll because I think it's beneficial. We'll keep discussing, but like the first one is I just want to get like a general feel of, who's attending this webinar on which quote unquote side of the business do you live on? Are you on the business side? Are you on the IT side? Are you other? For us, I think there's value in starting with some historical context, right? Because it's easy to get caught up in the 2023 idea that data is a corporate initiative. We all need to figure out how to leverage our data to be a true asset for our organization. That's a relatively new way of thinking. For the vast majority of, let's call the capitalist history of organizations, you've got a model whereby data is a means to an end. I have a way to onboard an item, maybe it comes through a PLM where engineers are putting various pieces of data in, but it's just a way to get to a finished good. That finished good is going to have a few attributes so I can make it sellable to my customers or sellable to my wholesale distributors. And then we have a sales team and we have various of getting those sales done. And then we have all the systems that support those things. We've got a PLM, we might have an ERP. We will have all of these different tools within the organization to power the business from an operational standpoint. And the data that goes into each one of those, they're just meant to get things done in a way that I can operate my business as effectively as possible in that moment in time. Now, one of the things you see even in the title of this webinar is default. Who had default ownership? Well, as we evolved into the 20s or the 2000s into the 2020s where we're at right now, we now see data as something that can help with true business intelligence, with predictive and prescriptive analytics, things like that, better customer experience. And well, since the data lives in the systems, I think you have this initial inkling to say, okay, IT should own the data since they own the systems. And then operations, they just operate around whatever the data mandates flow from IT. And I think some of this changes dependent on, if you're a legacy organization that's been around for a while, or if you're what we call a digital native organization, you were born in the digital world. I think maybe the business has more of an acumen towards the data than maybe some of these legacy organizations. But even still, there's confusion or just some assumptions being made on why data is being mandated in a certain area and not in others. So, a question to you, Rob, knowing that historical significance of, hey, we started as data being a means to an end to operate an organization, what challenges arise when IT is the exclusive, and I'm gonna use that word exclusive because I don't think this is binary, right? It's not like one organization owns the whole thing or the other, but what challenges arise when IT is the exclusive owner of the data?
Yeah, I think you set a good background for the question, right? Because I think that, as companies grew up, if, you're part of a, 200-year-old manufacturing company, you didn't really have the ability to measure the success of a lot of the things that you do around data. Now we do have that ability to measure that success and to promote activities that actually help us achieve that success. But because you never really put in the infrastructure to achieve that measurement, companies are kind of struggling to figure out how to make that work. And I'm a big fan of clear measurements. What are we going to measure? What are we going? What are our KPI for success as a business? And breaking those KPI down from, hey, we expect the website to do, 20% more traffic in a year, to getting as granular as possible on things that you can specifically measure that contribute to the overall total, right? Are we measuring click-to-order conversion ratios and the benefits of great content to digital shelf analytics and things that we can do on digital shelf? So when IT owns the business completely, there's a level of separation between those objectives that you would assign to the business and another group that might have differing priorities. More often, IT departments are set up by technology, right? So it's multiple different repositories of functionally the same information can live in multiple repositories. But there is no business owner that sits above those repositories and then ultimately creates the value proposition for the business all told, right? And those are real opportunities to kind of give business a little more power and agility. In addition, I think this is a bit anecdotal, but I think when IT owns data, or the perception is IT owns data, it contributes to a bit of a sniper culture. Right? Hey, the data is wrong. Look, somehow the data is wrong. Someone's to blame, right? And then reports go out and everyone talks about data being wrong. But nobody really has the ability to own it in context of achieving a business objective, right? So I'm a big fan of, organizing the business and organizing technology in order to enable those business owners, right, to go as quickly as possible, as few test cycles as possible. Just get out there, fail fast is what I love to say around data. Get out there and try to fail fast, right? Measure and then improve overall. And if business leads the way, that's fairly easy. It's easier for them to do. If IT is leading the way, then again, it creates a level of ambiguity as to how those objectives will get hit.
Right. Adam, any additional insights there from how Adam or how Rob has been explaining where we can find those hiccups or not really have the ability to build all of those potential use cases to support the business if it's exclusively with IT?
Yeah, I think Rob hit it nail on the head. There's like a limited accountability that comes into play when IT owns data, right? The moment that you assign data ownership to IT, does IT align with the overall business objectives? Are they responsible for the accuracy and quality of the data, as well as the storage, security, privacy, and everything else around it? Like, how much of that ownership really do they take? Many times we see like the ownership is viewed through lens of just security and privacy, and then they forget about all the other activities that go with that, right? So data ownership to IT is just, are we governing it appropriately, not necessarily are we measuring it? Is the integrity correct? Is it refreshed? Is there some type of drift from that? Like, they're not doing any of those additional validations that actually matter to the business, right? And something that I heard recently that I thought was funny to kind of build off of that was even some of the challenges when data is owned by IT is there's a lack of data accessibility. I recently heard that this phrase was used to define a type or a source of data. They qualified it as beg and borrow. So it was beg and borrow data, which was a source of data for them so that they could actually make business decisions. And they're saying that they're literally begging and borrowing that data from other teams because the data that they want is inaccessible to them because it's owned by IT. And I think you have this innate nature of resistance to change that comes from that. To just kind of expound on that a bit, where, IT organizations have like a multi-year backlog of transformations and things that they're doing. And it's just a huge ask, on them to be nimble, and adapt very quickly when, most IT organizations are sitting there focusing on moving mountains, right? And then they have these data requests coming in, it doesn't foster the kind of innovation, directly correlated to, business outcomes, right? So, I think everything that Rob hit on was nailing that.
I think you hit on a couple really good topics, because when we look at this whole idea of ownership, you have Rob who's bringing up, okay, what are like the business use cases that I need data to help me power decision making? And then to your point, Adam, it's also more than that. Just by nature, a lot of the times data that should be even accessible, even if they wanted to build their own silo of business intelligence, is sometimes inaccessible, inaccurate, doesn't get viewed as at a corporate level. So you've got both points here that I think hit on one of the core reasons why, at least from the three of us, we do feel like, hey, IT is extremely important for ensuring that we've got the proper systems in place that are capable of managing all of these business use cases and that can power the business. But the business at the end of the day needs to define this, right? It's not for IT to guess. And this goes to like defending the IT side of the equation, is that they can't just guess at what the business wants. The business needs to build a strategic vision for how they want to grow revenue, increase efficiency, build corporate value. These are the three pillars of what a business is trying to do when they operate, and figuring out how data can help accelerate any one of those three things within their organization is critical. So yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, just kind of leaving that out, I think, when you're in an IT-centric ownership model like that, coming from, the years of experience that I have, you heard in that model. So when you walk into an organization that's very much driven by IT and the data is owned by IT, you hear a lot of this is the way it is. And it's very restrictive in terms of affecting how, organizations' competitiveness out in the market is, right? So the moment that you start opening those doors, things start changing.
And then, Vinny, a point I'd like to add is, you're very right. We need business to define the data, right? We need corporation to define the objectives, business to define the data they need versus those objectives, but they also need the agility to change that recipe almost at will.
Yeah.
There is no set rule for, what data should look like. It's constantly going to evolve. So building that agility into the business to support those objectives is equally as important as that initial definition.
And I think you bring up a very good point, because what happened in, let's say, the late 80s and the 90s, when all of a sudden there was this view on let's make supply chain as efficient as possible. This is really pre-internet e-commerce business intelligence, and it is about managing supply chain. You had all of these ERPs come through, and you had the major players. You have SAP. Here's item and material master. Here's the definition for it. It's not going to change really, but it's going to make logistics super effective within your organization. And they were absolutely right. ERPs transformed organizations to be, more just in time, more effective with how they managed vendors and how they managed shipments out to their customers, things like that. But as we've now essentially exponentially scaled the amount of data, not only in product data, but in data we want to get from our customers, data that we want to get from our vendors, data that is third party, that has nothing to do with what we collect. All of a sudden, that just being cobbled together, there's no true rinse and repeat like there was. And we all know, folks on this call who've been through ERP implementations, those are still massive, massive things to do within an organization. Now imagine scaling that beyond a model that has a defined data dictionary. That becomes really, really difficult. So in here, you're going to see a few polls that we're going to send to you. First and foremost, we just want to get, a check of within your organization, which side do you sit on? And then what you'll see, we're going to evolve it. So we're going to say, where do you sit on? And then the question is going to be, who owns data at your organization? Followed by a third question, that is who should own data. I'm very curious on this. So what is your own role? And then who do you feel like owns data within the organization? And then who should own it? And I want to be very clear, right? We have kind of a clickbaity title. Like we're coming into this saying like IT shouldn't own it, business should own it. But the fact is, it's a Venn diagram. We all know that. But we do feel like the default was, hey, you know, everything is IT's responsibility from the data. We're essentially saying, and where we've seen it be very successful within the organization, that we want to move some ownership and truly build a Venn diagram that not one side or the other is completely tipping the scales on how data is managed. And to be very honest, from how I view it, you essentially build this third intangible area. Sometimes people call it a data governance office, where data stewards live, and you have a data governance council. So with that, like thinking about this from a true pragmatic approach, Adam, do you have like what is your view on, you know, how do we even get this done? Why is business important to this? Which I think we've answered why business is important to data initiatives and to the data vision. But what does it look like at the end of the day in terms of that Venn diagram?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously an assessment of understanding where you are, and we'll come to that later. But I think what I typically come into, you know, either an enterprise governance program, a master data program, or anything around data from that perspective, and you start having this type of discussion, I start splitting the data owner into two roles. And so I define the data owner being what you would traditionally think of, you know, as the owner of quantifying that data, you know, the organization or classification of that data, defining the quality rules, the who, what, where, how model of that, right? Like what you would traditionally consider an owner. And then there's the second role of the data custodian or conservator or keeper, however you want to call it, which is, you know, they're truly ensuring that this policy that's being defined, that this definition of the data is being enacted and is truly responsible for the storage of it. And the way I always typically try to paint this picture in most people's minds is, you know, I think of like a safety deposit box at a bank, right? I own what's in that box, right? But the bank is ultimately the keeper of those assets. So you have to start like splitting that perception of who's truly owning it. And realistically, the business is defining, you know, the way they want that data to operate, whereas IT is just the facilitator in that regard. And so I just split that definition to help organize and keep focus on it, because it is hybrid. I mean, we can even see from the poll results that a lot of people believe that it needs to be hybrid. But what role does IT take versus what role does business take? And I always say that the business takes the ownership, the IT takes the custodian.
Rob, anything to add from Adam's comment there?
Yeah, I think you'd also thrown a flavor of the question on how do you get started with this type of transformation, right? And you know, I'm a firm believer that if the C-suite doesn't understand the value of data, then you can improve things throughout the organization, but you won't improve for long. Right. At the end of the day, you'll be making you know, departmental specific adjustments. You'll be achieving a little more results, but you'll still struggle with the same problems organizationally, trying to justify why you need some sort of governance across your data landscape. Right. So you do need that top-down endorsement, but ultimately to get that, you know, I've seen a whole bunch of different techniques in order to kind of get started around the idea of data initiatives. You know, even you know, nice articulate, you know, use it from the outside. I often quite use, you know, visual examples of, hey, here's what's wrong. Right. You know, you can talk about data in the abstract forever, but when you show a company that underneath their, you know, red push buttons that they're trying to sell, the picture is green, that speaks volumes to how their brand is performing in the market, right? At the end of the day, who's going to buy a red push button if the picture is green overall, right? So grassroots initiatives that kind of connect back up to data, right, can achieve some benefit, but you want to make sure that you have you know, you're working through channels appropriately, right, and not just, you know, using sniper fire in order to make those examples. And then the other thing that almost always works or is a great influencer of data strategy is outside in. You know, what are your customers perceiving about the data? How, you know, what are other people saying in those public environments where they have an opportunity to talk about it? And if you were to work with the organization and coalesce those individual data points and talk about those data points, you have a pretty good argument for organizational change.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
I think that's I think that's very underestimated, Rob. You know, the whole like voice of the customer, especially in the B2B commerce world, you don't see enough of that. We see that a lot in the B2C side. We just don't see it enough in the B2B side.
Agreed.
It's I like the word or term grassroots, Rob, that you brought up, because even if I pull back from my experience, one of my longest, most successful customers that I worked with, the way that it began was actually some cynicism up top where they're like, we operate fine, everything's going well. And then we started talking with some of the folks who are managing both the onboarding of data, the maintenance of the data, and then pushing it outbound. And it was just full of, we can't do this, or we should be doing this. Because what you have is you have a successful model. Nobody is saying that your business is unsuccessful. You could be, you know, growing gangbusters in terms of sales and revenue. We're not, it's a false equivalency to say, hey, an organization with bad data is going to be a bad organization. That's a really false equivalency that we want to push to the outside. That's not true. What you're missing out is essentially opportunity cost, right? Because you may be viewing the world in one singular way and not realizing that people on the ground wish they could be doing it differently so that things could be even better. And I think that, and then once people start opening their eyes on like, oh my gosh, like we can't even run a report to see global sales right now, like something simplistic like that then starts getting into a bit of a rabbit hole on more of the nuance that falls into it, is essentially the eye opener for a lot of leadership to then say, okay, all of a sudden I'm recognizing areas of massive, I mean, areas of opportunity is one thing, but this is areas of massive opportunity that that we can leverage.
Yeah, and Vinny, I often use the metrics argument, right? In that same context. Great, you've set a data-driven goal, you've hit it. How do you double that next year?
Yep.
How do you keep continuously improving, right? Because if you see it as a project, it's one and done, you've done that, you've ticked the mark. But in reality, you can constantly get better, right? There are constantly new tricks and tips you can use around data management and, you know, saleability of data, you know, that will continuously improve if you put the right infrastructure in place, and then constantly go back and then challenge those business objectives again and again and again and again as part of a multi-year roadmap.
Yeah. I mean, I love that point, because what is a lot of what we hear sometimes in the industry is, well, why would I put CapEx funding in this? I have an equation where if I go hire 10 more outside sales guys, right, I'll get some measured increase in revenue by doing that. Or if I'm a brick and mortar retailer, right? I'm only in 22 states right now. I know if I add states, I'm going to increase. You're absolutely right. But the same thing occurs in data, and probably at a much more at a much longer runway, because we know what we know at the very beginning, right? We know the direct pain points. I wish I could do this. Sure, let's do an initiative where we can clean that up, and all of these wish lists are taken care of. Now we've got a baseline within the organization. There are use cases that have been undiscovered. There are ways that we can model the data that have been undiscovered, and there are ways that we can hit on those three pillars of efficiency, revenue gain, and corporate value that there's almost an innumerable amount of ways to continue to model it, either by cleaning it up or by extending and enhancing data standards and structures within an organization. So very, very good point there. So we've talked about a lot of this from a theoretical standpoint, right? We've come in here, we gave historical context saying, hey, this is how it began. It started as a default where IT owned systems, therefore they ended up owning data. I think a lot of people are starting to recognize that business needs to at least have, they need to have skin in the game, and probably a little bit more. Skin in the game is very top level. But where have we seen this being leveraged successfully. It's one thing to just stand here as consultants and say, this is what you should do. Look at all this opportunity cost. Look at all these things that we can be doing around data. But are there examples that we can pull from on, where things have gone well? Or I'll even inverse that, where people had good intentions and maybe it didn't go so well. And obviously we're not naming names here. The goal is to understand at an actual example level of how these things can work. So Adam, I'll push that question to you first, and then we'll see if Rob's got any examples.
So real world examples. There was an industrial manufacturer I worked with over in France that from the very beginning, I think they recognized, and I think this just kind of goes to speak to something Rob mentioned earlier, that there has to be executive leadership buy-in. Without it, it's a hard road to go down. And with this manufacturer, I thought it was very, very great that they didn't quite know how to articulate what they were going for, but ultimately, they recognized that it was imperative that they understood the who and what at its fundamental level do they start with, right? Like that was right where they got to, which was the who is going to own certain data assets and what are those data assets. So they took that perspective from the very beginning of, and they tackled that with an ERP consolidation project within that. So it was kind of like tied into it, and it was very narrowed focused beginnings of an enterprise governance program that eventually
was
transitioned
it initially
into...
owned by IT? Just curious, really quick. Was the initiative originally owned by IT?
It was initially owned by IT from the project perspective, but they articulated very well, and that's what I really liked at the beginning of it, because I'm looking back at this, right? Like hindsight's always 20/20, and you don't recognize it until you're in the midst of it. But it was an IT-driven project, but their executive leadership was so focused on involving and ensuring that the business stakeholders were there from the get-go and actually being involved in the decisions that were made, that the processes that were created were so well documented within that. So they were very focused on documenting, okay, what is the process of this decision and how will we make future decisions based off of this? That because they had the IT and business buy-in to that process, it was so much easier for them to start expanding into larger IT projects. So when we got beyond, they were in the middle of the ERP consolidation, it was multi-year, but when they started launching, a master data program within there, they already had these processes documented in terms of ownership. So they came to the table already defined with, okay, who owns what data and how are we going to handle that, right? And so now the storage and organization of it was handled by IT, but the actual, governance of that was already predefined. So that made our project so much easier coming into it. It was beautiful.
Well, what's interesting is because you start an ERP consolidation project, program, initiative in an organization, there's nobody here that's going to argue that's not owned by IT. That is the quintessential IT program, right? Like that needs to get done. But the fact that the mission that not only are we going to consolidate to some, model that we're considering our enterprise model into that singular consolidation, but that they incorporated business to build out, again, going back to that term of use cases, or how the business needs to leverage it in the most efficient way possible. That's important, right? That's a case where maybe it's 90% owned by IT, but you bring in business to make sure that, you're going to spend millions on something like that. You might as well make sure that the business has that skin in the game to tell them about pain points or tell them about things that they want built into the process. Yeah. Rob, what about you?
Yeah, so I think just kind of genericizing a little bit about companies that are kind of doing it right. I do see in retail brands, right, and I'm being specific to product data, retail brands generally do pretty well at understanding that business runs those projects. And retail brands just have a very limited use case, mostly around syndication of data to channel partners. And those channel partners, more or less, they really just have the same data standard with, a few little nuances left and right? But they're asking for the same types of data, the same level of data, the same vocabulary around data. So the use case is fairly limited. And I do see good partnerships with IT in those scenarios in which IT takes care of the back end, right? Give me all the logistic information I need, serve it up in the right way. Let's make sure that's all consistent. But in that case, you're kind of piggybacking onto existing processes with a master data management approach that allows syndication. So, on the small scale, we see that work. On the large scale, right, we're all, we've all talked about data governance organizations and the role of data governance within an enterprise. Now, I've always hated data governance as a term. I think a lot of us have. It implies that Big Brother is sitting over your shoulder, watching everything that you type every single moment of the day. Please speak into the camera, right? But at the end of the day, I think those data governance organizations have done a good job at identifying data ownership and putting the pieces in place that if there are unidentified pieces of data within the organization, at least there's a process to go out and get those. You're always going to struggle with a data governance organization justifying the top line or justifying that, the existence even of a data governance organization without a strong association to business objectives. And, at that level, that's where I see a little bit of failure or a little bit of opportunity to improve, right? The data is governed. We understand who the stewards are, but how quickly are we integrating that with business objectives and how nimble can we be to achieve some of those business objectives? It seems to me we'll go through an evolution over the next few years, right? Those organizations that have that level of governance and now understand the question, understand the base of what they have, right, and have some ability to affect that can now apply a little bit more digital sophistication in the support of hitting those business objectives. Whereas, I think a lot of data governance organizations started on the back of a lot of failed implementation attempts or failed change attempts. As we kind of, kicked off this meeting with, the worst thing in the world is not even knowing where the data stewardship and the data ownership is. Mm-hmm. So I think people going with those data governance approaches certainly across large multinational, multi-divisional organizations makes a lot of sense. But in truth, the model that succeeds the best is one that it's specific to your organization, right? And there's no other way to phrase it. In my mind, it combines, people that understand technology really well, people that understand, certainly in the product environment, you have to understand your product really well. What are the characteristics of the product? How are we going to go to market with the product? What do we think is important, not important? And then data literacy. Right, that's not an assumed subset of either one of those other two disciplines. You can't just assume because someone's in IT, they truly understand how to structure data, and you can't assume that people that understand the product really understand what product attribution needs to look like. So I always like to say, if you've ever gone to like a B2B website or any website with lots of industrial products, say 400,000 industrial products, and you can find anything, that's a sign that behind the scenes they had figured out how to align their expertise in the right way. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, even though technology is wonderful, everything would be absolutely chaotic and unfindable unless you have the business discipline around data and data attribution behind it.
Yep. I think you
so Rob, if I'm
if
I'm hearing you properly, what you're saying is just the very act of having a plan is better than no plan. Like that's kind of the whole point, right? Is you need to have some type of framework in place beyond just it's a tick in the box, so to speak.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what is really, because Rob, you hit on two things that I feel like are extremely important for me to kind of echo. One was data literacy, the other was data governance. So the data literacy part, it's interesting because sometimes we'll go in and people will say, oh, my financial hierarchy is what drives the business, right? Or my ERP hierarchy is what, I can't pay my sales team if I don't have this financial hierarchy. Or conversely, it could be like the customer experience is the most important thing and this drives it. And in all of those cases, you're actually breaking rules of how I want to build a true functional data standard within an organization, because each one has a core essential end customer, whether it's for finance, for sales, for supply chain, or for an end customer, or for an end consumer purchasing products from me, right? So all of those are going to be designed in a way that appeals or acknowledges the reason for the end user to manage it. When you create a corporate data model, that is essentially a new user, but a corporate data construct should be viewed as an agnostic perspective.
Right.
I'm going to build this so that it is the most effective way. And there's a lot of, like, people get reluctant, scared. They're like, well, I need these other ways of doing it. And part of it is education, because you have, platforms. Indigo, for example, is you don't just say I create one data model and it overwrites every other data model within your organization. In fact, the point of it is to say, by building governance, which again is that scary word, I can actually make everybody's lives a bit easier, because I'm going to fundamentally model something into a core structure and then extend it into whichever way that my business needs to operate. I know that SAP or Oracle ECC or wherever, or excuse me, SAP ECC is going to have their own data dictionary. And then I know that I'm going to have a merchandising model. I know I'm going to have a sales model, and that's okay. But I can fundamentally maintain everything in one spot that supports the entire business. And then going to what you first started talking about, is data governance, and I think you rightfully so. Like, a lot of people, they think of it as Big Brother, or a way to hamper their work process, right? And this is a new, not new, but this is a focal point that we've been seeing a lot more within organizations, where they simultaneously recognize they need data governance, and then they know that they're going to get massive pushback by the organization if they even attempt to enable data governance. And it's almost one and the same between the data literacy and the governance. And then you have to add in what I think is essentially the reason for that fear of data governance is change management.
Right.
Change management is the problem with data governance. It will go in, and somebody could be working on AS400 for 30 years. You cannot say that going to Syndigo is going to be quicker, faster than working on a green screen in AS400, because they're going to know every single hotkey. They're going to have every free text field the way that they've got the tribal knowledge built in their head to manage the onboarding of a product, for example. But when we move into a more governed model, I now reduce tribal knowledge. I get to a modern platform that's more scalable, that can support extended data models and data standards. And we can reduce the reliance on singular individuals. We reduce the reliance on free-form text fields or Excel databases or Excel spreadsheets that we need to upload and import into the system, which we get from who knows where. A lot of people do shared spreadsheet models. We can unify a workflow. So when we think of governing the data, we don't want to necessarily view it as a way to destroy people's work process. In fact, it makes it so that we can scale that work process better. Now, that's not to say that you could screw that up and tighten the screws too much and make it so that we have an inability to move forward. But that's part of what we want to accomplish there, is to bring in governance while creating efficiency. Go ahead.
I think, Vinny, you hit a very, very important piece there, because I actually was thinking about this earlier, where, when you start stepping into governance, I feel that too many people, kind of going to Rob's point about, Big Brother and things like that, too many people perceive governance as being about security and compliance.
Yeah.
Where there's so many other activities that are truly what creates business outcomes on governance. And I always help businesses, or anybody that we deal with around, strategy and governance and things like that, help them understand that it's not about scaling time, reducing silos, all that other stuff. But I really quantify it around, you're repurposing that time, right? Like, that's ultimately what governance is doing, is it is repurposing the effort that's going into the data lift now into better activities.
Yep.
And that's kind of the way I look at it. So I think you hit 2 points there, where it's a lot around everybody is scared of governance because it's so focused on security and compliance, when it needs to be focused on business outcome activities. And, from the lift and shift and the added responsibility that comes into what most people think of is really about repurposing the effort that you're already putting forward to kind of listening to that one organization talk about beg and borrow data, right? Like, what if it was no longer about begging and borrowing? You had that data, right? And it was easily accessible and you owned it. Well, how do we repurpose that time?
Yep, I like that. So for the last poll question of this webinar, we had talked about these 3 pillars of what we want to accomplish with data. What we're interested to know is, if we look at these 3 options between data can help me increase operational efficiency and margins, it can help me grow revenue, it can help me grow my corporate value. When you look at the initiatives that you're either thinking about or enacting right now, which of these 3 does it most fall into? Again, we're looking at most initiatives straddle a bunch of these, but what does it mostly fall into? And by the way, so there's less than 15 minutes left. We've got a few questions out there. If you've got questions, or if you're just curious about some topic, please enter that into your chat, and we will get going with some of our first questions here. And so this is interesting too, by the way, before I even get into the questions. So in order, it's increase efficiency and margin, grow revenue, and then corporate value is third, which, if I were to hypothesize, that's exactly where I feel like I would fall into as well. Rob, any thoughts there in terms of how this poll came back? I mean, it seems a lot.
No, that's totally expected, right? At the end of the day, everyone understands data processes as they're currently engineered are cumbersome. There's too much effort, too much redundancy over cycles. So I'm not at all surprised to see increased operational efficiency. And I think growth in revenue is probably representative of the audience, right? How many e-commerce people appear in the audience, right? Because all the e-commerce people would have, prioritized growth in revenue. So I do see it kind of falling in that same order in the clients that I'm talking to today.
And I think corporate value is it's a niche yet extremely important use case. If you are a PE-owned company, for example, you've gone through many acquisitions over the past years. What's your job? Your job is to say these acquisitions make 1 + 1 = 3. And that's our driving goal, to acquire and then merge all of these entities into a singular force, essentially. And building out good data standards is extremely hard when you're a high acquisition organization, right? Because you're inheriting new technology, you're inheriting new processes, nothing is aligned. And I think corporate value might not be the biggest reason for data initiatives in the aggregate, but I think it's a very important data initiative for a specific use case of a type of organization, like a PE-led one or high acquisition-based organization.
I think we actually may see that corporate value number start going up over the next couple of years, because we're seeing a lot of governance. I've seen this, and friends of friends know this, but we're seeing a lot of governance really kind of come into play from an ESG perspective. When you start getting into, the social responsibility and things like that, governance starts becoming well, if you don't have that house in order, how do you have your other house in order?
Right. So I'm going to get into some questions now. We sort of answered this one, and I think you got into it. So maybe Adam, I'll ask you this. In your experience, what role does executive sponsorship play in a successful data ownership transition?
Yeah, I saw this pop up, and I think that's interesting. Yeah, I'm a firm believer that management can enact some control and meaningful change, but as I mentioned, without executive sponsorship, it's just a very long road, and it's not going to be an easy one to get the level of buy-in that you want and to get the alignment that you want. It's a very uphill battle. I do believe that kind of a bottom-up governance is starting to become a thing, but it still needs to be a strategic imperative for it to even be a bottom-up. If you're trying to, come in as the leader of a business unit and try to enact that change, centrally, you may be able to make some change within your own organization, and rightfully so, and I think you should. But trying to make organizational level change always has to come with executive sponsorship.
It's funny. I think that like to that point, and it kind of there's another question in here on where do the conversations even begin, and I think
Yeah.
that you, if we were to look back at all of our most successful types of engagements, you almost have an outside in type of model. You have the executives who all agree there needs to be a change, or we need to leverage data better as an organization. We know that's out there. And then at the ground level, you have like a recognition of pain. You have the recognition of pain at the ground level. You have a strategic vision at the top level. That's going to be your biggest starting blocks for a successful initiative in getting your data up to par or to truly create a future state vision. Because without one or the other, it's like I could have an executive vision, but the people on the ground are just doing their business. They don't see much pain. That's going to be heavy in change management, right? Or the other way, if everybody feels the pain, but I need to do extensive convincing for my CapEx dollars or to actually do what I want to do, that's also painful because that's business case scenario. So it's like heavy in change management versus heavy in business case and convincing of the higher ups. Rob, do you feel like that is a good summary of
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
And I'm also appreciating that more and more companies are seeing this as a C-level responsibility, right? So we are seeing the rise of the chief digital officer or chief data officer, specific mandates, with companies still trying to work that out. What is the role of the chief information officer versus the chief data officer? And there's still needs to be a little bit of thought put behind that corporate alignment, because we've seen enough battles or turf wars start to happen, right? But we don't want that to happen. But I do think it is a good sign that we are seeing, larger organizations understand and appreciate that role of data. And I've seen during change management or implementation of programs like this, often you will hire or you'll bring in from the outside someone with experience running this level of transformation somewhere else. And someone who appreciates the nuances of the data being different from systems. So that does help. But again, I'm always a huge fan of grassroots does get things done. One of the most common thing, and we hear it all the time, is organizations that know they have pain but don't know how to articulate it. Right. And those become your champions, right? Helping them articulate their pain in a way that, again, ties into business objectives not being met, can get that executive sponsorship. At a grassroots level, we've used the term before. So,
right. So we do.
I think it's about getting
I'm
sorry, just Rob. I think it is about just the whole point is focusing on that initial level of pain to get the conversation going, because it does need to trickle up to C-suite, but it can start within different elements of the organization. I've even seen it start with legal and compliance, just right there in and of itself. It's an inkling of a discussion, but can start expanding to greater benefits when you start involving a broader audience.
Yeah. And I think that flows into, we've got time, I think, for two more questions. And Rob, you were starting to get at this, I think. So in which scenarios, especially at the level of corporate data maturity, would a designated data leader model work most effectively? Like, when do you pull the trigger for getting that sort of role within an organization?
Yeah, and almost always I like to see that aligned to a corporate aspiration, right? Are we trying to, like the polling question of before, what is it that we are trying to accomplish as an organization? And then data leadership makes sense when you have enough of when you've done enough of discovery that you can actually influence the data in that particular silo, or you can make those changes overall. So in terms of data literacy and maturity of an organization, and when they appoint a leader, I think that it would be, after making sure that leader can be effective in the role, right? And how do leaders end up being effective in the role? Well, you have to at least, have enough of a data inventory and enough of a vision of what it is that they're supposed to do, and enough maturity around the organization to supply them with the information they need in order to do the job and to start improving that particular area. So I wouldn't, if it's completely Wild West and, nobody knows where any of the data is, it's a different transformation initiative, right? To help identify governance within the organization to enable that level of business owner, right? So, you know, I've also worked with a lot of business leaders that have stepped in thinking that they're owning a silo of data or a particular domain of data, when really, you know, they've been called in to define what it is within the organization, right? There has been nothing as a baseline to start with, right? So as long as there's that level of discovery and, you know, there is the ability to move a needle or hit a business objective, I would start appointing business leaders soon after that, because I really do think it's the passionate business leaders that will drive the data literacy within an organization.
I think that part of the issue is what you don't want to do is create a lame duck chief data officer, essentially, which
exactly
is
what we're seeing a
and
lot of now.
unfortunately we have
Yeah.
seen they essentially have no budget, have no decision-making power. They were put in without a clear directive, without a clear vision, without a clear budget. If you've got a directive, vision, and budget, then it's like pull that trigger at that high level. Now, if you don't, you still may want to do it like somebody who's at a data steward level. You're not necessarily the chief data officer of an organization, but there might be areas where we can start saying, okay, we want to hire in some focal points of, you know, data leadership within the organization. We're not mature enough yet. We're not ready yet for like a chief level or a VP level, but maybe at a managerial level or somewhere like that, especially with, you know, considering your own size of an organization. Everything is a little bit different dependent if you're mid-market versus Fortune 500. But I would say that's very important. We've talked to a lot of chief digital officers where we've given empathy, where it's like we're trying to support, but they just sometimes they don't have the full C-suite support from them. All right, go ahead, Adam.
No, I was going to say, I think it's very clear, just to kind of like draw like a very straight line, is, you know, what it comes down to is, when is it most effective? It's most effective on when I know where I'm at and I know where I want to be. If you have those two things, then at that point you can either hire leadership internally or bring an external party in to help get you there, right? But if you haven't assessed where you are and you haven't defined where you're going, you're lost.
Yeah. Last question, with 3 minutes left. Let's look at it the opposite way now, right? So we know buy-in is critical. What happens if we're at a level where we're trying to convince the C-suite or the executive leadership group to buy in on a data initiative and we get pushback? Are there any tips or advice to build out a fundamental model of saying, hey, business needs to own the data, and it's like coupled in with IT right now? Anybody?
Rob, do you want to tackle that
Yeah,
first?
yeah, no, I'll jump on that. I think it's a great question, right? And for me, it's about gathering not one but multiple use cases or business cases, and soliciting your peers, right? So, you know, even though I might be in marketing and being frustrated, supply chain has their challenges with data, right? The rest of your peers also have that level of challenge with data. So, you know, build your own little steering committee, right? And start meeting with the steering committee and expand the team a little bit just to do diagnostic and a little bit of reporting. And you'll find there are allies within the organization that you didn't instantly see by, you know, creating a report about bad data that you're just looking at right now. And, you know, I also find, you know, there's a phase during, you know, master data management implementations. I always jokingly call it heroes will rise, right? And we're laughing because we know exactly what that means, right? And that's the people that are incredibly passionate about data, knowing what needs to happen with data, but not finding the right way to get an audience with that data. And, you know, I've seen organizations succeed as just lunchtime conversations where all the data people kind of got together and said, all right, what kind of challenges are you having? And ask for a little bit of permission to explore and then define that into a plan.
Awesome. With 1 minute left, anything else to add there?
No, I think that you hit it right on that. That was great. I mean, I tend to see that, you know, the moment that you start addressing these things, because I think it's important to recognize that knowing where you are is literally the first step, right? If you don't know you have a problem, you're not going to get anywhere. And really assessing what that problem is fundamentally and being able to sell that internally is going to help drive that conversation.
Perfect. All right, guys. Adam, Rob, thank you very much for the time today. Everybody who is on the webinar, thank you very much for listening to us today. There's a QR code if you want to talk to us after, if we want to talk more than happy to continue the conversation. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.